Welcome, and we'll start off with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'direi Torah.
Amen.
And I'm going to go ahead and share with you. And we have, in fact, completed all the passages, the Rashi's passages in Deuteronomy for Vazot HaBracha. And they are on my site, on my website, and my YouTube website. And I think if you simply look up Mordechai Miller Parsha Studies, that you'll catch the link right there. That's you'll find it. So at any rate, here we go. And this is actually one of my favorite statements. Interestingly enough, it's quoted from Yerushalmi Nidarim. It's from the Jerusalem Talmud. This is Nidarim are oaths, where you make a promise to do something. Chapter 9, Halacha Dalet. Ze Sefer. So this is referring to this particular verse, Ze Sefer Toldot Adam. This is the book of the generations of Adam. Bayom Baro Elohim Adam, on the day that God created Adam, Bidmut Elohim Asaoto. He made him in the image of God. Okay, so Tanya, early statement, Mishnaic origins, otherwise, in other words, prior to the year 200. Rabbi Akiva, very famous Tana, Rabbi Akiva Omer, V'ahavta l're'acha kamocha, quotes the verse from Leviticus, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, from Parshat Kedoshim, from the Parsha of Kedoshim in Leviticus, chapter 19. I have to remember that reference. Klal Gadol b'Torah. This is a major general principle, as opposed to specific mitzvahs, right? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You realize, of course, if people actually did that, it would be interesting, right? It would be world changing. However, he has someone, a contemporary, who disagrees with them. Ben Azzai, Ben Azzai says, Ze Sefer Toldot Adam, this is the book of the generations of man, Klal Gadol Mizeh. It's an even greater general principle. He's actually, of course, finishing up the verse where he's saying, of course, here, that man is created in the image of the divine. The concept that if we hold close to our hearts and our minds, the idea that every single human being is created in the divine image. It speaks volumes as to our relationship to those human beings when we might feel otherwise, right? But if I were to break it down a little bit, I would say that our relationship has to be kindness and justice. Kindness and justice. And what's interesting, of course, is that from a biblical and Jewish perspective, the administration of justice, even when it involves punishments, are actually an act of kindness to that person's soul. We are protecting them, and especially in consideration of eternal life. Because no matter what, we face the consequences of our decisions and our behaviors, whether for good or for bad. So I'm going to break a little bit and share a little something. So I have this pineapple guava tree. And one thing I realize about fruit trees is the level of generosity that they are capable of. This guava tree takes very little care, and this year it has produced many fruits. I have one little problem. So just to know that I'm not, as I tell you the story, you should not think too well of me. I don't love pineapple guavas, but the truth is that even if I did love pineapple guavas, they're way more produced by the single tree than I am capable of ever benefiting from, me or my family. So I went on next door and I said, I have pineapple guavas. If anybody's interested. And it turned out that there were quite a lot of people interested, interestingly enough. I'm not saying I didn't consider it, but the truth is, I simply felt that I didn't want to take any money for this. The tree had been generous, and it was a responsibility for me to be generous. And so I figured out a way to put them in a pot, a large pot, and I put a sign down. Because there were so many people who wanted to have them, that they should take. First of all, I thought maybe half a dozen. Somebody pointed out that it was hardly worth the trouble to just come for a half a dozen. So I decided a dozen of these, which probably came to more than a pound, was okay. And so I put a sign up on the pot saying that they should take up to a dozen. And the small guavas, because some of the guavas are very small, I said 2 for 1. They're welcome to do that. And I put it out at the top of my driveway. And in the course of the day, people came and helped themselves. And what was very interesting was that up to a certain point, everyone was very honest about it. There were always lots of guavas left in the bucket. So later on, I came to my door and somebody had left a little box of Bigelow tea bags. And I was very touched because I didn't ask for any compensation. And here clearly was someone who felt they didn't want to just take something for nothing, that they wanted to, in a way, pass it on, right? To also, but I was really touched by that. Well, later on, apparently, there was someone who simply took the entire. I had this basket lined, this garden bucket lined with a liner with a sign on it, and somebody just took everything that was left, including the sign. Okay. So, okay, I'm not going to draw this out too much longer. I just
Did
thought
they leave the basket?
they left the bucket.
Oh, they left the
They
bucket.
just
Okay,
they just
good,
took the liner and the
good.
sign that was attached to the liner. I thought, oh, interesting, interesting. Um, anyway, later on, I did get a message from, I think, the person who did that, who said, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and I realized I took more than I didn't read the sign, etc. I realized afterwards.
What
So,
was in the bucket?
guavas, the guavas.
Oh,
Yeah, the guavas are probably, who knows, maybe there were 30 guavas, 25 guavas left in by the time they took it. But it was very interesting. It's like there were lots of people who just really were respectful and appreciative. And of course, this one person who was amazingly appreciative. Anyway, uh, I was wondering who did it, but it was, at least they said they did and they apologized. And my wife said, "Look, what you should do is thank them for letting you know." So that's what I did. I thanked them for letting me know. But at least their conscience took them as far as admitting that they had done it. So just an interesting experience, in terms of trying to be kind, trying to be kind. But certainly, for the most part, people seem to appreciate it very, very much. And I thought it was a story worth sharing with you today. Anyway, in this context, let's take a look, right? We are created in the divine image and from Ben Azzai. So here we go. Quite a careful analysis on the part of Torah Temimah. Rabbi Akiva Romez. Rabbi Akiva is alluding to the Mashakatuv, right? To what is actually, this is one of my favorite stories from the Talmud that is coming up in a second. He's alluding to what is stated by Agadah de Shabbat, in this Agadic material. Oh dear. In the tractate Shabbat of the Babylonian Talmud, page 31a, there's some wonderful stories about Hillel, about Rabbi Hillel's patience, right? An earlier rabbi than Rabbi Akiva. Bahahu Oved Elilim, about a certain idolater, Sheba Lifnei Hillel, that came before Hillel, Sheyilamdenu Kol HaTorah, that Hillel should teach him the entire Torah, Keshehu Umed Al Regel Achat, while he was standing on one leg. This is a famous, famous story, right? Came, and of course, what was he doing? He was mocking him, right? He was, in a sense, mocking him. But this again, a story of Hillel's patience, right? Amarlo. So Hillel said to him, "Ma de'alach saneh lechavercha lo ta'avid." What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor, to your associate. Again, interesting, right? It's the other, I guess, could we call it sort of the obverse, maybe, of you shall love your neighbor as yourself? What is hateful to your neighbor, what is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor, right? And think about the events of this world and some of the absolutely atrocities that are committed. And if these people followed this particular law, right, these wouldn't have happened. None of these atrocities, the atrocities of history. And here we are. Look at humanity, right? And what humanity is capable of. And because they don't appreciate the value and the truth of this principle, they don't act according to it. And there are terrible, terrible results. This is the foundation of the Torah, which to my mind also says that if you don't have a basic attitude in this world that follows this principle, everything else in the Torah is nothing. It's not worth anything. It has to be founded on this principle. Zohi kol Torah, Hillel went on to say, this is the entire Torah. The idach, and the rest of it is pirisha hi. It's v'chole. It's the commentary, as people have said, right? That's how it's very often translated. Or you might say it is, deconstructing it. It's explaining it, etc. V'chule. V'hakavana, so Torah Temimah goes on to say, the hakavana, that the intention was, that chamo she'alecha sanu, okay, just as it would be hateful to you, ze she'yavid, I think ya'avir al dvarecha, someone who transgresses your word. In other words, when you ask somebody to do something and they intentionally, or either one way or the other, they don't do it, right? You're asking them to do something and they don't do it. Because we know everybody has a will. Kach lo ta'avor ata. So you shouldn't transgress al mitzvat Hashem, over God's commandments. You don't like it. You ask people to do things for you and they don't. Well, how do you feel about when God asks you to do something? And of course, God is in a position to command you. Shebata lilmud Torato, right? Since you came to learn his Torah, his teaching, his instructions. Vezehu Yesod HaTorah. And this is the foundation of the Torah. In other words, right? Remember one of my favorite phrases, that the subtext of the Torah is doing what doesn't come naturally, right? And also really avoiding and trying to get rid of the attitude of, ain't no one gonna tell me what to do. You can see it right here, right? The idach pirusha, right? And where he goes on to say, and the rest of it, pirusha de milta, that the explanation of that remaining phrase that he said, Ladat ezu davar sanu lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You need to find out what is hated by God. Zil Gamir, that's what he said to him. Go study, right? So you understand the principle, but then you have to know what it is that God doesn't want to do you to do, that hates for you to do. Bezohi kavanat Rabbi Akiva kan. And this is Rabbi Akiva's meaning. This is the intention, right? This is the kavanah, his intention here, kan, al derech drash v'lachut halashon, by way of, interpretation and his use of elegant language. Yes, David.
So, okay, but if others don't do, what you ask of them,
Yes.
then, I mean, of course, if you do what God asks of you, that's part of this. But then what about others then? If they don't do what you ask of them, are you supposed to do what they ask of you? I mean, how does all that fit
Right.
back together again?
Right. Yes. So I think that, the little story I told, right, where I sort of went off topic in a way.
Yeah.
I think the truth is that, as I reflect on this experience of mine, it is so clear that most people appreciate kindness. Some appreciate it more than others, right? Some people wrote a thank you. One person left a little gift. And then one person didn't pay attention to the sign and took the whole thing. But look at what it's worth doing. Would I repeat the experiment? I certainly would. And I hope I'm answering your question, right? You don't do it on the basis of whether other people are going to follow it. It's sort of like that wonderful statement that says, let peace begin with me, right? Unless, if you're waiting for both sides to somehow spontaneously act properly, it ain't going to happen. But again, I remember it's not just kindness, it's also justice, right? Although in this particular case, it wasn't for me I'm not in the authority of pursuing justice here, with regards to the person who wasn't careful. Um, I think you still do it. But David, please go further, and maybe I'm not fully comprehending the question you're asking.
Well, I mean, you've answered it. I think there's the point about, being taken advantage of, right? Because if others ask of you, and you always, help other or do things for others, whether it's helping them or whether it's in, a work function or whatever it is, but
Yes.
then, they don't respond to you, then
Yes.
then you're being taken, there's crossover point between, to be taking advantage of, right? So that's not a good thing either.
No,
So
you're
so
right.
so I'm trying to figure out how do you balance that? If you know what I mean? So yeah, that's what I was asking.
True. And maybe at that point, that's where justice has to kick in. All right. But nevertheless, I'll be honest with you, after all my years of acting as a rabbi, I don't believe there's any more effectiveness that I have than trying to set an example. That's all I can do, whether it's in my family or in my community. You know, uh, you do the best you can, and again, I hold by the current etiquette regarding phone calls these days, which is I don't pick up the phone if I don't recognize the number. Okay. And because I know they can leave a message if they are a legitimate person, possible if it's a legitimate phone call, at the very least, they'll leave a message and I'll get back to them. And I think that has to be, but then I would expect the same for myself. I wouldn't expect any different. Okay. In terms of the work thing, that is difficult. I think you've got to just forge ahead and do what's right, and as long as what they're asking of you is legitimate, isn't necessarily taking advantage of you in the sense of these horrible situations where people essentially lure people into giving up all their money, those kinds of things. And that's really where justice is required. Um, I think that short of that, you just can't live in that world. If you understand what I think
Oh,
I'm saying.
absolutely. No, no, I do understand what you're saying. I think that's, yeah, I think you're right that it does cross into the justice part of it, has to come into play. And that's probably where the boundary is, right?
Right.
If it's everybody feels, if you feel you're being taken advantage of, but yet, it's not really something that's unjust, like you said, maybe that's a reflection of you're not being, or should be more kind. So I think, yeah, message taken. So, okay. I don't want to belabor this.
Oh, no, you aren't. It's an important point you're raising. Seriously, it is very
Yeah.
important. The other piece is that by not following their example of not being appreciative, but rather being appreciative, I believe there is at least a hope that they will understand, and that perhaps they will actually try to be a little more appreciative. And I think it at least opens up that possibility. And as opposed to other options which destroy that possibility.
Yep.
So, yeah. Okay. Let me go on with this. Let me see if I can get to the end of this before we run out of time. And because he goes on, I mean, he's trying to analyze this carefully. Right? And what he sees, what is apparent to him, right? Law to him, to attach zehadrash, this particular interpretation, right? Al zehalashon, on this expression, meaning how he derives what is hateful to you, you shouldn't do to your neighbor, from the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's what he derives it from that passage, right? Mishum, and he says, because the peshitut, it's quite evident. Kasher ha'inyan letzavot al hadam. It's very difficult to command an individual she'ehav et chaveiro, that he should love his neighbor kamo she'ohev et atzmo. In other words, how do you wind up commanding a person to love someone? So in other words, he's simply saying that's just an elegant way of saying what he's saying, which is what is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. And that the application of that is something much more practical than commanding people to love someone like you love yourself, right? And I get that. I don't feel you can love everyone as you love yourself, but you can be kind to people. You can be respectful. You can respect your enemy. You can respect someone who you don't love. And part of this respect is, if it's hateful to you, don't do it to them, right? ומפני שזה דבר הנמנע מצד הטבע. And because the ability to love every single other person as you love yourself, or to love your neighbor as you love yourself, is something that isn't naturally capable. One isn't capable of it in terms of human nature. V'gam Rabbi Akiva ba'atzmo, and even Rabbi Akiva himself, Svarale, he's of the opinion, and he's citing Baba Metzia, page 62a. Chayecha, he himself says, Chayecha kodmin l'chayecha vercha. There's a famous situation that's mentioned there, I'm pretty sure, where you're stuck in the desert, right? The two of you stuck in the desert, and there's just enough water for one of you to get to the next oasis. Just enough water for one of you. What do you do? What do you do? That's the question. So, because if you split the water, right? If you split the water, neither of you are going to make it. I mean, that's the way it's being set up. We can't speculate here, right? On the other hand, if one of you drinks all the water and is able to make it, the other person is going to die. And the answer is that if you found the water, you don't, according to Rabbi Akiva, right? Your life has to precede this other person's life. It's an awful, tragic situation, but in the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that's the way you solve it, right? And for this reason, Darish she'ahava zo, that when it's talking about this quote love, Perusha, actual explanation of it is ha'ader hasin'ah. What it means is removing hatred, right? The absence of hatred. V'hainu, and that is shelo ya'aseh keneged ritzono, and that is to say that he shouldn't intentionally or to do what he doesn't want, what your neighbor doesn't want. V'im la'adam kain, and if that's true of human relationships, makol shechein HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how much the more so regarding our relationship to God, right? We have a lot of things. I don't know that we even realize to what degree our own personal will, right, dictates things to other people who are close to us. How much we are asking them to do things for us and expecting to have it done. And if every time they turn around or they even neglect it, right, I forgot, it still has a message. So, okay. Uven Azzai, Ben Azzai Mosif, he adds, the midivrei Rabbi Akiva, that from the words of Rabbi Akiva, Sham Inan, we learn, Rak ma da'alachsani lechavero lo ta'avid. We only learn that which is hated to you, right? You shouldn't do to your neighbor. But imkain, and if this is the case, mashma, it would imply, suppose you're the kind of person who is light upon honor due to you, right? You're not that fussy about it, right? And in that case, right, if we're following this principle, since being disrespected is not a big deal to you, well, that means you can disrespect other people, right? Because you don't hate it, right? So you can do it to others. I'll say Omer. For this reason, he says, Zeh Sefer Todot Adam. And that's why he quotes the statement, this is the book of the generations of man. Bidmut Elohim asa oto. He made him in the image of God. Hine, and so, ein ra'ui la'adam. It is not appropriate for a human being, lahakel b'chvod zulato. He's not able to take lightly the honor of another person, of someone else, meaning to be disrespectful to someone else. Lo rak mishum da'alachsani, not only because being disrespected yourself is hated, you hate being disrespected, elagam mishum shenivra bidmut Elohim, but also because that person is also created in the image of God, in the divine image. Ve'im mekel b'chvodo, and if he is disrespectful of him, right, if he takes his honor lightly, in that case, it's similar to one who is disrespecting the Creator. And in another place, we have gone into detail over this particular matter. I love this particular section that we just did, I think because it's of such profound importance. And please God, we will take a look next time at the next verse. So I'm going to stop the share if any of you have any comments you'd like to make. Okay.